The wind that scoured the valley floor was a thing of teeth and bone, carrying not the scent of pine and sage, but the cold metallic tang of blood, left too long in the sun. Elias Ward reined in his weary gelding, the leather groaning in protest. Before him stood the gate to his uncle's property, a crooked sentinel of sun-warped timber. But it was not the gate itself that held his gaze, that drew the air from his lungs in a sharp, silent gasp. It was what adorned it. 5 women. They hung from the crossbeam, suspended by thick hemp ropes, their bodies turning slowly in the ceaseless wind. Tattered calico dresses, whipped to shreds by the elements, fluttered around their still forms. Their hair, matted and wild, curtained their faces, and their bare feet, bruised and swollen, swayed to the rhythm of a silent, ghastly dirge. Pinned to the chest of each woman was a crude placard, the words, "Burn deep into the wood." This ain't your land. What belongs to Morrison will always belong to Morrison. Elias's hand, calloused from war and work, tightened on the reins until his knuckles were white bone. His throat was a desert of dust and ash. This was to be his sanctuary. A final letter from Uncle Jeremiah, pages filled with the promise of peace of land to heal a soul fractured by cannon fire and the ghosts of good men. What greeted him instead was this tableau of frontier brutality, a monument to a savage power that claimed dominion over life and death. His horse, a sensible beast named Boulder, snorted and stamped, sensing the profound wrongness of the place. Elias swung a leg over the saddle, his boots landing with a heavy thud on the cracked red earth. Each step toward the gate was a lifetime. The wind whistled through the skeletons of cholla cactus like a phantom sigh, and the sun-bleached bones of a long-dead steer lay half-buried nearby, a testament to the land's unforgiving nature. He reached the nearest woman, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. Her skin was cold, waxy. He expected the stillness of death. As he reached to check for a pulse, his eyes caught a glint of silver clutched in her frozen fingers. It was a locket, small and oval, etched with a familiar pattern of wild roses. The world tilted. Time collapsed. He saw that locket not in a stranger's hand, but resting against the warm skin of his wife Sarah, her laughter echoing in a sun-drenched memory from a life before the war. He had given it to Jeremiah for safekeeping when he'd gone east, a final sacred piece of her to be kept safe until his return. To see it here clutched in the hand of a hanged woman was not just a crime. It was a desecration, a violation of a memory more precious than any deed or title. Rage cold and pure burned through him. This was no longer about a parcel of land. This was about a line that had been crossed, a sanctuary defiled. He pressed his trembling fingers against the woman's neck. A flicker, a thrum of life so faint it was almost imperceptible. He moved to the next and the next, a pulse weak but stubborn. Another. They were alive. Morrison, whoever he was, had meant for them to die slowly, a spectacle of suffering for any who dared approach. He hadn't counted on Elias arriving so soon. The rage in his chest found its purpose. It sharpened into a point of chilling clarity. This was not a warning he could heed. It was a challenge he was bound to answer. He drew the heavy skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. The steel was cold in his hand, a stark contrast to the fire in his blood. He reached up, his gaze fixed on the frayed rope above the woman clutching Sarah's locket, and prepared to make a cut that would sever his past from his future and declare a war he had never sought. The cabin was a derelict shell, a skeleton picked clean by time and neglect. Dust lay thick as burial shrouds over the crude furniture, and the wind moaned through the gaps in the chinking. One by one, Elias had carried the women inside, laying them on the floor near the stone hearth. He worked with a grim, methodical focus, cutting the bindings from their wrists and ankles, his jaw tight, as he took in the full measure of their abuse. The flesh was a raw tapestry of rope burns, and deep purple bruises. Lashes laid with vicious precision crisscrossed their backs as he coaxed a fire to life in the hearth. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment the cabin felt like a tomb. But then a cough, ragged and wet, broke the silence. The woman who held the locket, his locket, stirred. He knelt beside her, a canteen of water in his hand. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He gently lifted her head, tipping a few drops of water past her cracked lips. Her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a stormy sea, deep and turbulent. They fixed on him sharp with a primal, cornered animal fear that slowly gave way to a weary assessment. As he tended to her, the firelight triggered a memory he spent most days trying to outrun. It came not as a story, but as a series of jagged fragments, the suffocating pall of gun smoke under a Georgia moon. The confusion of a midnight skirmish. Shouts from his own men, their blue uniforms rendered gray and indistinct in the chaos. His order to fire on a shadowy tree line. And then the scream. A Union officer's scream, followed by the horrifying realization that they had fired upon their own patrol. He remembered a man's face contorted in agony, a captain's insignia on his collar. He'd been told later the officer, a Captain Thorne, had died. The incident was buried a tragic footnote in a war filled with them, but the ghost of that man had followed Elias West, a constant, silent accusation. He had come here to the place Jeremiah's letters described as the last quiet corner of the world, to finally lay that ghost to rest. Jeremiah's letters had been his compass, his hope. "The air is clean, Elias. A man can think out here. A man can forget what he needs to." But the land before him was not a place of forgetting. It was barren, hostile. The soil was stone, the creek bed a dry, rattling scar. The cabin, which his uncle had described as sturdy, looked as though one strong gust might return it to the dust from which it was built. It was a place of broken promises, and now a place of broken bodies. He moved to the next woman, a redhead, whose defiance seemed etched into the very lines of her face, even in unconsciousness. Then a slender blonde girl who looked too young to have seen so much of the world's cruelty. A fourth with dark, watchful eyes that even now seemed to be calculating, analyzing. And the last, an older woman with a calm, grounding presence. He finished his work as the last of the five began to stir. He had cleaned their wounds as best he could with whiskey and strips torn from his own spare shirt. They were a tableau of suffering. Yet in each of them, he saw a flicker of the same stubborn life he'd felt in their pulses. He stood and walked to the door, peering out at the hanging rope still swaying from the gate. He knew what he was doing. He knew the name. Morrison. Burned into those placards was a brand of ownership on this entire valley. By bringing these women inside, by offering them water and warmth, he had already trespassed far beyond the boundaries of the law. He was sheltering another man's property. He turned back to the room. The woman with the stormy eyes was watching him. He walked to her, knelt, and gently pried the silver locket from her fingers. The metal was cold against his palm. It felt like a relic from another man's life. "This was my wife's," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't know why he told her. Perhaps to explain to himself why he was about to do what he had to do. He strode back outside, the knife still in his hand. The fifth rope, the one that had held the red-haired woman, hung empty. It was the last one he had cut. He stood beneath the gate, the wind tearing at his coat, and stared at that length of hemp. Cutting it had not been an act of rescue. It was an act of rebellion. With that final slice of his blade, he had picked up a weapon in a war he was just beginning to understand. He was no longer just Elias Ward, a haunted veteran seeking peace. He was the man who cut Morrison's ropes. And in this valley that was a death sentence. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of wood smoke and antiseptic whiskey. The women were propped against the walls, wrapped in dusty blankets Elias had found in a storage chest. They were weak, their bodies a testament to the ordeal, but their eyes were alive, burning with a light that had been banked but not extinguished. The older woman, whose name he learned was Grace, was the first to find her voice. It was steady, resonant with an authority that pain could not diminish. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her gaze unwavering. It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact. Elias sat on a low stool across from them, the Winchester rifle resting against his thigh. He said nothing, merely watched and listened. The red-haired woman, Ruby, pushed herself up, wincing as the movement pulled at the raw flesh on her back. A bitter laugh, sharp as broken glass, escaped her lips. "He's signed his own death warrant, is what he's done. Morrison doesn't tolerate charity, especially not for his property." The young blonde Sadi flinched at the word property and pulled her blanket tighter, her eyes wide with a terror that felt fresh and bottomless. The fourth woman, Violet, remained silent, her dark eyes missing nothing, her expression a mask of cold observation. It was the woman who had held the locket who finally spoke to him directly. Her name was Clarabelle. Her voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "That man, Judge Morrison, he owns this valley. The law, the guns, the land. He believes he owns the people too. We were a message. He wanted anyone who came to this place to see the price of defiance." Elias's knuckles went white where he gripped the stock of his rifle. He had suspected as much, but hearing it laid bare made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a brutish thug. This was a man who had twisted the very concept of law into a weapon. Ruby's anger was a palpable force in the small room. "If you have a lick of sense," she spat, her gaze daring him to argue, "you'll get on your horse and ride until this whole rotten valley is just a bad memory. We're already dead. You stay, you die with us." Elias looked from face to face. He saw the fire in Ruby, the brokenness in Sadi, the quiet intelligence in Violet, the weary strength in Grace, and the unyielding will in Clarabelle. He saw 5 lives that had been discarded, deemed worthless by a tyrant. He felt the weight of the locket in his pocket, a cold reminder of a life he had failed to protect. He finally spoke, his voice low and resolute, filling the space between the crackling flames. "I cut those ropes." He let the words hang in the air. "From that moment, your fate became mine." A flicker of something surprised skepticism, perhaps even a dangerous sliver of hope, passed through the women's eyes. Clarabelle leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharp planes of her face and the deep, angry welt on her neck. Her lips curved into a tired, defiant smile. "Then listen close, landowner," she said, the title laced with irony. "You didn't just inherit a cabin. You inherited a war." Her words fell with the finality of a gunshot in the dead of night. Outside, the wind howled a mournful cry that seemed to echo her declaration. Elias knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the peace he had traveled 1,000 miles to find was a dream that had died at his gate. The road ahead would not be marked by fence posts and furrows, but by blood and powder, and the long, dark shadows closing in around them. 2 days passed in a tense, fragile quiet. Elias hunted, bringing back a lean jackrabbit that Grace stewed with wild roots. They worked to make the cabin defensible, boarding up the larger gaps in the walls, securing the shutters on the 2 small windows. The women's strength returned in small increments, but their spirits were a different matter. Their stories emerged not in a rush, but in fragments, shards of memory offered up in the hushed hours after dark. Grace spoke of a small ranch she and her husband had built, a place Morrison coveted for its access to the river. When her husband refused to sell, he was found dead, branded a cattle rustler. Grace was left with a fabricated debt she could never repay. Ruby's voice was laced with venom as she described the general store her family had owned. Morrison wanted it as a depot for his shipments. When my father said no, the store burned. They dragged me from the embers while my little sister screamed. Sadie's story came in whispers, punctuated by trembling silence. Her family's farm was small, but it was theirs. Morrison's men accused her father of horse theft, a charge that carried a hanging sentence. He offered a deal, Sadie murmured, staring into the fire. My father's life. For me. My father used his last rope on himself the next morning. Violet said little, but one evening she produced a small oilskin-wrapped pouch. Inside were folded documents, land deeds with forged signatures, shipping manifests for goods that were never delivered, and a ledger detailing payments to sheriffs and magistrates across the territory. I was his clerk, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. He thought because I was quiet, I wasn't watching. We don't just carry scars. We carry proof. On the third morning, the fragile peace shattered. The rhythmic pounding of hooves echoed from the valley trail, a sound too deliberate for a stray horse, too disciplined for a simple posse. Elias was on the porch sharpening his knife, and he was on his feet in an instant, Winchester in hand. 3 riders crested the nearby ridge. They were not the ragged thugs he'd expected. They wore matching dusters and star-pinned vests, deputies of the law. The man in the lead, thick-set with a drooping mustache, sat his horse with an air of bored authority. Clarabelle appeared at his shoulder, her eyes narrowed. Deputy Miller, she breathed. Morrison's right hand. Stay inside, Elias commanded, his voice low. All of you. Don't show yourselves unless I give a signal. He stepped off the porch, positioning himself in the open yard, the cabin at his back. He stood calmly, the rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, a posture that was neither aggressive nor submissive. The deputies trotted down the slope and reined in 10 yards from him. Miller spat a stream of tobacco juice that stained the red dirt. Howdy. The deputy grunted, his eyes sweeping over Elias, the cabin, the newly repaired gate. You must be Ward. Heard you took possession. That's right, Elias said, his voice even. We're investigating a report. Miller continued, his tone dripping with false sincerity. Some property of Judge Morrison's went missing a few days back. 5 head of indentured servants. We tracked them to this area. You wouldn't have seen anything, would you? Elias met his gaze without blinking. I saw 5 women hanging from my gate when I arrived. Looked to me like an attempted murder. I cut them down. A second deputy, younger and eager, shifted in his saddle. Those women are fugitives, mister. They absconded on their contracts. The only contract I saw was a rope around their necks, Elias replied, his voice hardening slightly. They were on my property, half dead. I gave them aid as any decent man would. Miller's eyes narrowed. He had expected a squatter easily intimidated. He hadn't expected this quiet, unmovable presence. That's mighty charitable of you, Ward. But the law is the law. Judge Morrison wants his property returned. We have a warrant for their arrest. Then you'll need another one for mine, Elias said calmly. One for harboring, I expect. But you'll serve it on my land, and right now you're trespassing. Unless you mean to arrest me, I'd ask you to leave. It was a calculated gamble. He was banking on the fact that Morrison wanted this handled quietly, without the fuss of official arrests that might draw unwanted attention from territorial authorities. He was daring them to escalate, to show their hand not as lawmen, but as enforcers. Miller's hand drifted toward his pistol. Elias didn't move, didn't even tense. He simply watched, his gaze as flat and gray as a whetstone. The deputy saw something in that gaze, a lack of fear, a familiarity with violence, that gave him pause. This was not some farmer who would buckle. This was something else. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. Miller finally let out a gruff sigh and pulled his hand away from his gun. The judge is a patient man, he said, the words a clear threat. But his patience has limits. You're making a grave mistake, Ward. He wheeled his horse around the other 2 deputies, following suit. They rode away without a backward glance, their departure as ominous as their arrival. Elias watched until they were gone. He hadn't fired a shot, but a battle had been fought and won. He had established the cabin as his territory a fortress, but he knew it was only a temporary victory. Miller's threat hung in the air, a promise of the storm that was coming. He turned and went back inside, the weight of 5 lives and his own resting squarely on his shoulders. The days that followed were a blur of labor and preparation. Under Elias's direction, the cabin transformed. They reinforced the door with an iron bar salvaged from a broken wagon wheel. They filled sacks with earth and sand, piling them behind the windows to create crude but effective breastworks. Ruby, who had grown up around horses and knew their ways, fashioned tripwires from old rope and tin cans at the perimeter of the yard. Grace, practical and resourceful, took stock of their meager supplies, rationing the food with a stern hand. Sadi, in a quiet act of faith, began tending a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin, turning the soil and pulling weeds, her focus on creating life in a place defined by death. Violet spent her hours poring over the documents she had saved, arranging them, trying to piece together the full scope of Morrison's criminal empire. It was she who urged Elias to go into the nearby town of Redemption. "They see you as an outsider, an outlaw," she explained, her voice precise. "You need an ally. Even one. Someone who can get word out if things go badly." The town of Redemption was a collection of clapboard buildings cowering under a vast, indifferent sky. It was Morrison's town. That much was clear from the moment Elias rode in. Men tipped their hats to the deputies who patrolled the main street, their deference born of fear, not respect. The sign on the largest building read, "Morrison Mining and Land Co." He tethered Boulder outside the blacksmith's forge, the only establishment that seemed to operate with its own rhythm, independent of the town's suffocating atmosphere. Inside, a mountain of a man, with arms like tree trunks, hammered a glowing horseshoe into shape. His name was Silas, and his eyes were wary when Elias approached. "Looking for work?" Silas grunted, not pausing in his work. "Information," Elias said, "and supplies." He bought Nails a new axe head and a sack of flour, paying with the last of his silver dollars. As Silas counted the coins, Elias spoke quietly. "I'm the man who took over Jeremiah's old place." The blacksmith stopped counting. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Heard about that. Heard you found some trouble out there." "The kind of trouble that gets pinned to a gate," Elias said. A flicker of something disgust, maybe sympathy, crossed Silas's face before he masked it. "Some things in this town are best left unseen. A man wants to live a long life, he learns what not to look at." "I'm not looking to live a long life," Elias replied. "Just a right one." He paused. "My uncle wrote that this was a good place, that the people were decent." Silas let out a short, harsh laugh. "Jeremiah was a good man, an optimist. That's a dangerous thing to be in Redemption." He pushed the sack of flour across the counter. "Take your goods and go, friend. There are no allies for you here." As Elias was turning to leave, Judge Morrison himself stepped out of the land office, flanked by 2 of his men. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a black frock coat, his silver hair neatly combed. He moved with a stiff, precise gait, favoring his left leg, with a slight but noticeable limp. He commanded his men with short, clipped phrases, his voice carrying the unmistakable ring of military authority. "Secure the perimeter," Morrison ordered, gesturing to the street corner. "I want a full report by sundown. No exceptions." The phrase, the limp, and the ramrod posture, it all snagged on a wire, deep in Elias's memory. The chaotic image of the friendly fire incident flashed in his mind, the smoke, the shouting, the face of the fallen captain. He couldn't place it, but an unsettling sense of familiarity washed over him, as cold and sudden as a winter shadow. Their eyes met across the dusty street. Morrison's gaze was like chips of ice, intelligent and utterly devoid of warmth. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture not of greeting, but of acknowledgement. of a challenge accepted. Elias loaded his supplies and rode out of town, the judge's cold eyes following him all the way. He hadn't found an ally, but he had found something else, a piece of a puzzle he didn't yet understand, a ghost from his past, wearing a new and terrible face. The war in the valley was growing more complex, its roots reaching deeper than he could have ever imagined. That night, the mood in the cabin was somber. Elias relayed his experience in town and the cold reception from the blacksmith, the chilling encounter with Morrison. He commands his men like a soldier, Elias mused, staring into the flames. There's a discipline to them. And a limp. I've seen it before. Violet looked up from the papers spread before her on the floor. His past is a mystery. The official records say he came west after the war, a lawyer from Ohio, who made his fortune in mining speculation. But the records are thin, almost curated. She pushed a particular document toward him. It was creased and water-stained, a military commendation that had been used to wrap a bundle of contracts, likely discarded as trash. Most of the text was illegible, but a few words stood out. Bravery in the face of Battle of Cedar Creek. Captain Marcus Thorne. The rest was a blur of faded ink. Thorne Elias whispered the name, a cold stone in his gut. That was the officer from the friendly fire incident. The man he believed he had killed. Reported killed in action, he added, his voice hollow. Clarabelle watched him, her stormy eyes searching his face. What is it, Elias? A ghost, he said, shaking his head to clear the fog of memory. Just a ghost. The opportunity to confront the ghost came 2 days later. Morrison was holding a public auction, selling off parcels of land seized for unpaid taxes. It was a legal farce, a public display of his power. Elias rode to redemption, leaving the women on high alert, his mind set on a dangerous course. He found Morrison holding court on the steps of his land office, the townspeople gathered before him like a flock of nervous sheep. Elias pushed through the crowd until he stood at the front. He waited for a lull in the proceedings. Judge Morrison Elias called out, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmuring crowd. Morrison turned a flicker of annoyance in his eyes that was quickly replaced by a mask of polite inquiry. Mr. Ward, to what do we owe the pleasure? Have you come to your senses about my property? I've come to ask about an old soldier, Elias said, his gaze locked on the judge. A man I served with. Fought at Cedar Creek. A brave officer. Captain Marcus Thorne. The silence that fell over the crowd was absolute. Morrison's face became a stony mask. The polite facade crumbled, and for a split second, Elias saw the man beneath a predator, coiled and lethal. The limp seemed more pronounced as Morrison took a half-step forward. He leaned in, his voice a low, menacing whisper, meant only for Elias. Some ghosts don't stay buried, Ward. Especially the ones you make yourself. He straightened up, his public smile returning, but his eyes were filled with a murderous fire. The confirmation was unspoken, but absolute. Judge Morrison was a fiction. The man standing before him was Captain Marcus Thorne, the ghost from his past, resurrected by hate and twisted by a thirst for vengeance. Elias finally understood. This was never about the land. It was never about the women. Jeremiah's cabin, his inheritance, it had all been bait. A carefully constructed trap, years in the making. Thorne hadn't just survived that night in Georgia. He had been reborn from its ashes, and he had come west to orchestrate the complete and utter destruction of the man he blamed for his ruin. The battle for the valley had just become a personal war. The revelation changed everything. The threat was no longer a faceless entity of greed. It had a name and a history, one deeply entwined with Elias's own past. Thorne, no longer hiding behind the veneer of Judge Morrison, escalated his campaign with ruthless efficiency. The first blow was legal. A territorial marshal, a man clearly in Thorne's pocket, rode into redemption and posted notices. Elias Ward was officially declared an outlaw wanted for theft assault and harboring fugitives. A substantial bounty was placed on his head and on the heads of the 5 unnamed female accomplices. The town, which had been wary, now became openly hostile. Doors were shut in his face. The whispers that followed him were no longer just fearful. They were greedy. The second blow was strategic. Thorn cut them off. Men were posted on the ridges overlooking the valley, ensuring no one could get in or out. Their meager supplies began to dwindle. The creek, their only source of water, was a half-mile from the cabin, a dangerous open run. Each trip became a life-threatening gamble. The third blow was personal, and it was the cruelest. One evening, the sound of a horse galloping hard reached the cabin. It was Silas, the blacksmith's young apprentice, his face pale with terror. They took him. The boy gasped, having risked his life to ride out. Thorn's men. They dragged Silas from his forge, said he was colluding with an outlaw. Elias's blood ran cold. He had put Silas in danger simply by speaking to him. Thorn was sending a message: anyone who associated with Elias Ward would share his fate. The news that followed days later, delivered by the wind and rumor, was worse. Silas was being held in the town jail, tortured for information about the cabin's defenses, about Elias's plans. The isolation was absolute. The world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the cabin and the hostile land surrounding it. Fear, a constant companion, began to gnaw at their resolve. Sadi grew withdrawn, her work in the small garden her only solace. Ruby's anger simmered a restless energy that had no outlet, but it was in this crucible of despair that they began to truly forge themselves into a unit. Grace's steady presence became their anchor. She organized their defense, assigning watches, conserving every drop of water, every crumb of food. Violet, using her knowledge of Thorn's operations, began to devise a counter-strategy, identifying potential weaknesses in his network. He's arrogant, she reasoned. He believes he's won. That's a mistake we can use. Clarabelle and Elias became the heart of their resistance. They scouted the perimeter at night, moving like shadows through the rock and scrub. She taught him the silent language of the land, while he taught her the grim calculus of a firefight. A bond formed between them, forged not in words, but in shared danger and mutual respect. One night, as they lay hidden in an outcrop overlooking the valley, Clarabelle turned to him. "This is your fault," she said, her voice flat. "His vengeance is for you. We are just caught in the crossfire." Elias looked out at the distant mocking lights of redemption. "I know," he said, the guilt, a familiar weight. "When this is over, if you still can, you should all walk away. This isn't your fight." Clarabelle was silent for a long moment. "You're wrong," she said finally, her gaze meeting his in the darkness. "He tried to kill us. He made it our fight the moment he put those ropes around our necks. Your ghost is our demon, Elias. We'll face him together." In that moment, he knew they were no longer 5 victims and their rescuer. They were a company of soldiers, besieged and outnumbered, preparing for their last stand. The storm came without warning. It began not with rain, but with wind, a low, mournful howl that grew into a ravenous shriek. The sky turned a sickly shade of ochre as a wall of dust churned up from the dry plains descended upon the valley. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The world became a swirling vortex of sand and grit, a chaotic, suffocating blindness. And in the heart of the storm they came. The attack was not a charge, but a creeping infiltration, and the chaos of the dust storm and their perfect cover. The first sign was the sharp metallic snap of one of Ruby's tripwires, followed by a muffled curse. Then another. Thorn's men were using the gale to mask their approach, moving in from all sides. To the windows, Elias roared over the wind's scream. Gunfire erupted, the muzzle flashes appearing as brief, startling blossoms of orange in the brown gloom. The fight was brutal, intimate, and terrifying. Figures would emerge from the dust only yards away, their faces masked by bandanas, their eyes wide. The cabin's defenders fired into the swirling chaos, their shots aimed at shadows and sounds. A man scrambled onto the porch. Ruby, her face a mask of cold fury, fired the old Colt. The man fell back into the dust and disappeared. Sadie, trembling but resolute, stood beside Grace, reloading the musket, as the older woman fired the two of them, a small, determined bastion of resistance. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls, splintering wood and kicking up dust inside the cabin. A lantern shattered, plunging one corner into darkness. Violet, hidden in that darkness, used her hunting knife with silent lethality when a raider managed to pry open a shutter and climb through. He died without a sound. Elias moved from window to window, his Winchester barking each shot, a calculated act of defense. He felt Clarabelle at his side, a steady, deadly presence, her Navy Colt answering his rifle's roar. They fought back to back, a seamless unit born of desperation. Then came the fire. A thrown torch arced through the dust, landing on the dry shingles of the roof. Flames whipped by the wind took hold with terrifying speed. Smoke began to pour into the cabin, thick and acrid. "We have to get out," Grace yelled, her voice choked. As the fire spread and the attack intensified, Thorne wanted them flushed out, driven into the open. The roof began to groan, threatening to collapse. It was then that Elias saw him. Marcus Thorne, a specter in the storm, stood near the burning porch, a silver revolver in his hand, his eyes burning with a triumphant hatred. "It's over," Ward Thorne bellowed, his voice carrying over the din. "This is how it ends, in fire and ash, just like my life." Elias shoved Clarabelle toward the back of the cabin. "Get them out." "There's a root cellar door under the floorboards in the back." He turned to face his ghost. The main room of the cabin was now an inferno. A burning beam crashed down, separating him from the others. He was trapped alone with Thorne, who now stepped through the burning doorway, heedless of the flames. "You took everything from me." Thorne snarled, his face a contorted mask of rage and grief in the flickering firelight. His limp was pronounced as he stalked forward. "That night, your incompetence cost me more than my commission. A stray round from your volley hit the munitions wagon. It exploded next to the field hospital where my wife and daughter were volunteering. They burned, Ward. They burned because of you." The full, horrific truth crashed down on Elias. It wasn't just a friendly fire incident. It was a catastrophe of his own, making the consequences of which he had never known. The guilt he had carried for one man's death was nothing compared to this. Thorne raised his pistol, the barrel aimed squarely at Elias's heart. "I lost my name, my face, my family. I have spent 15 years rebuilding myself for this single moment. To watch you die knowing you are responsible for it all." Elias stood motionless amidst the flames and smoke. He looked at the man before him, a soul hollowed out by grief and consumed by vengeance. And in that moment, a profound and terrible clarity washed over him. He could raise his Winchester. He could kill Thorne and perhaps survive. But it would solve nothing. It would only be another death in a long, unbroken chain of violence that had started with his orders so many years ago. Slowly, deliberately, Elias lowered his rifle and let it fall to the floor. "Then end it," he said, his voice raw with a grief that mirrored Thorne's own. "No more killing. Not by my hand." Thorne stared, his finger trembling on the trigger. He had envisioned this moment for a decade and a half, but he had never imagined this. He had never imagined surrender. He had never imagined absolution. The hesitation cost him. From the smoke-filled chaos, two figures emerged. Clarabelle, who had refused to leave, swung a heavy iron skillet, striking Thorne's gun hand with a sickening crunch. The revolver clattered to the floor. Simultaneously, Ruby lunged, driving her shoulder into Thorn's chest, sending him staggering back into a wall. Before he could recover, the burning front door was kicked in. Silhouetted against the dust-choked daylight stood the imposing figure of Marshal Thompson and the honest territorial Marshal Violet had managed to contact weeks ago via a traveling priest. With him were Silas's wife and a dozen deputized townsmen, and their faces grim with a newfound resolve, finally spurred to action by evidence of Thorn's torture of the blacksmith. The siege was over. The war was done. In the aftermath, the dust settled both literally and figuratively. The sky washed clean by the storm was a brilliant, aching blue. The smoldering ruins of the cabin stood as a monument to the battle that had been fought. Thorn, his face a mask of disbelief and broken fury, was taken into custody by Marshal Thompson. His empire built on fear and deceit crumbled as the townspeople freed from his grip began to speak out. Silas was released, battered but alive, and the full story of Thorn's tyranny came to light. The days that followed were a time of quiet healing and difficult goodbyes. The town of Redemption began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding not just its structures, but its soul. Elias and the women stayed in the blacksmith's barn, guests of a grateful Silas and his family. They were a fellowship forged in fire and trauma, but they were not a family meant to last. Their paths, which had converged so violently, were beginning to diverge once more. Violet was the first to leave. With a quiet handshake and a nod of profound respect to Elias, she boarded an eastbound stagecoach with Marshal Thompson, her cache of documents destined to dismantle the last vestiges of Thorn's corrupt network across the territory. Her war was not over. It had simply moved to a new front, one fought with paper and ink. Ruby was next. She had reclaimed her family's land, but the desire for a quiet life was gone, burned out of her. Elias watched her train a wild Mustang in Silas's corral, her touch firm but gentle, her spirit as untamed as the horses. She spoke of heading north to the open territories where men like Thorn still operated in the shadows. Some folks are meant to build, she told Elias, her blue eyes clear and determined. I think I'm meant to hunt. Sadi found her peace in the simplest of things. She stayed in Redemption, helping Silas's wife tend her garden. In the rich, dark earth, planting seeds and nurturing new life, she began to heal the barren places within herself. She would stay, she decided, and help the town grow something better from the ashes. Grace, the anchor of their group, found her purpose in organizing the town's recovery. She became the unofficial mayor, her steady hand and unwavering moral compass, guiding the community as it found its footing. Each departure was a quiet pang in Elias's chest. These women, whom he had cut down from a hangman's rope, had in turn saved him from his own ghosts. They had given him a reason to fight for something more than just survival. Finally, only he and Clarabelle remained. They worked together, salvaging what they could from the ruins of the cabin, their movements easy and familiar, their silence comfortable. They were the two who had fought closest, who understood the shared language of the battle without needing to speak of it. But he knew her path too would eventually lead away from this valley. Weeks later, a fragile peace had settled over the land. The first green shoots were beginning to push through the scorched earth around the cabin's foundation. Some of the women had moved on to their new lives, sending letters that spoke of hope and purpose. Grace and Sadi remained in Redemption, pillars of the town's rebirth. Clarabelle had stayed on, helping Elias clear the land, though her gaze often drifted to the distant mountains, a silent acknowledgement of the wider world that called to her. One clear, cool afternoon, Elias walked alone to the small hill that overlooked the cabin site. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of pine and clean earth. From his pocket he took the small silver locket. He ran his thumb over the etched roses, the metal warmed by his touch. For years, Sarah's memory had been a source of pain, a ghost of loss that had driven him into isolation. But now it felt different. It was a memory of love, a part of the man he had been, not a chain holding him to the past. "Goodbye, Sarah," he whispered to the wind. He knelt and with his knife dug a small hole in the rich soil. He placed the locket inside and covered it, patting the earth down until it was smooth. He was not burying his grief, but planting it, letting it become part of the land he had fought for, a land where new things could now grow. It was an act of letting go, of finally accepting that his search for peace could not be found in running from his past, but in building a future. As he stood and turned to leave, he found Clarabelle waiting for him at the bottom of the hill. She had been giving him his space, but she was there. They didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. They simply shared a look of profound mutual understanding. A look that acknowledged the scars they both carried and the quiet strength they had found in each other. It was not a promise of forever, but a recognition of the present, of a hard-won peace they could share for a time. Tucked into the waistband of his trousers was a folded letter that had arrived with a traveling post-rider that morning. It bore the official seal of the territorial government. Marshal Thompson, impressed by Elias's character and tactical skill, had offered him a position as a territorial ranger. A job that would use his skills not for destruction, but for justice. A chance to protect others, to bring order to the wild corners of the frontier. He had come to this valley seeking an escape, an end to his story. Instead, he had found a new beginning. He had found his purpose not in the quiet solitude he had craved, but in the connections he had forged in the duty he now accepted. He had found his peace,